While playing in the sandbox, a 7-year-old boy noticed a rusty chain sticking out of the sand. The teacher decided to check out the find, but what she discovered at the other end prompted her to immediately evacuate the entire school. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning after the heavy rainfall carried with it a peculiar stillness, the kind that lingers in the air when the storm has spent all its fury and the world is left to catch its breath. The elementary school sat quietly against the gray horizon, the puddles along the sidewalks shimmering like fractured mirrors that caught the pale sun. On the playground, the scent of damp earth still clung stubbornly to the breeze, and the swings, slick with water, creaked faintly as they swayed under their own weight. Children rushed from the building during recess, their laughter piercing the silence with sudden bursts of life. They ran across the wet pavement, darted toward the climbing frames, and chased one another in clumsy circles, oblivious to the lingering mud and puddles. At the far end of the playground, away from the loudest shouts and games, stood an old sandbox. Its wooden frame, once painted in bright colors, was chipped and splintered, as corners worn to dull points. Few children ever went there anymore. It was considered too old, too uninteresting compared to the shiny new slides and painted hopscotch grids. Most days it remained abandoned, its sand hardened in places where weeds pushed through, a forgotten corner of the playground. Yet, for one boy, it was exactly the kind of place that stirred curiosity rather than dulled it. Jaden, a quiet 7-year-old with thoughtful eyes and a calm nature, preferred the sandbox to the chaos of the soccer field or the noisy slide. He liked the solitude it offered, the small kingdom of earth where he could dig, search, and imagine himself a discoverer of lost worlds. His skin glistened faintly under the sunlight, the droplets of sweat mixing with the lingering dampness of the morning, and his curls stuck stubbornly to his forehead. Other children often teased him for preferring to search for treasures instead of joining their games, but he never minded. He kept a box at home filled with odd finds, marbles long forgotten, shards of colored glass smoothed by time, and even a bent spoon he once believed might have been ancient. On that particular morning, as the others shouted and ran, Jaden crouched low at the edge of the sandbox. The rain had washed much of the loose sand toward the corners, leaving rivulets that exposed layers of darker, wetter grains beneath. He sifted his fingers through the grit, watching the sand stick to his skin before shaking it off. For a while, it was nothing unusual. Small rocks, a cigarette butt, a bottle cap dulled with age. Yet, something in the far corner caught his eye. It glimmered faintly when the cloud cover shifted, not bright like glass, but with the dull, stubborn gleam of metal resisting the earth around it. Curiosity quickened his pulse. Jaden leaned closer, brushing away the top layer of wet sand with the edge of his palm. A fragment of darkened iron emerged, rough with corrosion, so thick it didn't resemble the scrap metal he usually found. He pinched it, expecting it to come loose, but the object refused to move. He dug a little more, clawing back handfuls of grit. As more of the object revealed itself, his heart thudded with excitement. It wasn't just a piece of junk. It was a chain. A thick, rust-eaten chain, its link broader than his small hand, trailing deeper into the ground as though tethered to something waiting below. He tugged lightly, half expecting it to slide free, but it resisted with a weight that suggested it belonged to something larger than he could imagine. His breath caught with the realization. A buried chain seemed like something out of the adventure stories he loved, where pirates anchored treasure chests beneath the sand, or explorers unearthed relics of forgotten times. For a moment, he imagined himself the hero of such a story, the one who stumbled across the first clue. The sound of children laughing faded into the background as he lost himself in the discovery. Each handful of wet sand he pulled away revealed more rusted iron, the texture scraping against his fingertips. He wondered how far it went, whether it ended just a few inches deeper or whether it stretched endlessly beneath him. His small chest swelled with the determination to find out. From across the playground, Miss Roberts, one of the supervising teachers, noticed Jaden's hunched figure. At first, she thought he was simply building a mound, one of his usual quiet games. But his posture seemed tense, his movements intent rather than playful. She began to walk toward him, the damp grass brushing against her shoes as she called his name. Jaden didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the rusty chain, his hands still busy pulling and digging. Only when her shadow stretched across the edge of the sandbox did he glance up, his expression filled with a strange mix of excitement and confusion. "I found something," he whispered breathlessly, his small voice barely rising over the wind. He pointed at the chain, half buried but undeniably real, its links heavy with the scars of age. Miss Roberts bent down, expecting perhaps a lost toy or discarded piece of playground equipment. Instead, her brow furrowed as she brushed the sand herself, feeling the rough, stubborn resistance of the corroded metal. It was not a toy. The link was thicker than her finger, with a weight and permanence that felt wholly out of place in a child's sandbox. She followed the curve of the chain with her eyes as it vanished into the sand, disappearing downward into the earth. A ripple of unease pricked her skin. She straightened slowly, scanning the playground as if suddenly aware of its silence. Jaden, oblivious to the sudden tension rising in her, smiled faintly as though he had uncovered the start of a grand mystery. His small hands were dirty, his knees soaked from kneeling in wet sand, but his eyes shone. To him, it was an adventure. To her, it was something else entirely, something that did not belong, something with a history no child could imagine. The breeze carried the scent of rust and wet earth between them. The other children continued to play at a distance, unaware that the quiet corner of their playground had become the threshold to something buried, something hidden for decades. Miss Roberts felt a chill despite the faint sunlight, her mind already turning with questions. Why would there be a chain beneath the sandbox? What could it possibly be connected to? As she looked down again, the wet grains of sand slipped away from the chain like water fleeing from stone, exposing just a little more of its length. The impression of weight, of some unseen anchor below, pressed into her thoughts. She reached instinctively to brush the grit from her hands, but the feeling lingered, as if she had touched not just corroded iron but the edge of some forgotten story written long before any of them were born. Jaden tugged again, and the chain shivered faintly in its bed of earth, a subtle tremor that hinted at something vast below. Miss Roberts's breath caught. She almost told him to stop, but the words froze on her tongue. The playground noise seemed very far away now, swallowed by the sight of that ancient iron rising through the sand like a warning from the past. The boy's innocent excitement contrasted so sharply with her growing unease that, for a moment, she could only watch, torn between curiosity and dread. And as the chain gleamed faintly beneath the dull light of the morning sky, she knew with sudden certainty that whatever lay buried there was not something meant to be found by children at play. The sight of the chain lingered in Miss Roberts's mind long after she first crouched beside Jaden. The corroded links looked impossibly out of place against the pale, rain-dampened sand, as if the earth had been forced to reveal something it had guarded jealously for decades. She could not shake the sense that she was intruding on a secret buried by time itself. Jaden, meanwhile, was still kneeling eagerly, scooping away handfuls of wet sand with a persistence that came naturally to children when curiosity took hold of them. His fingers were raw from the grit, yet he continued, determined to uncover more. Miss Roberts reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, meaning to tell him to stop, but her curiosity held her back. The chain was so strange, so substantial, and there was something compelling about the way it disappeared into the earth as if connected to an anchor hidden deep below. She rose halfway to her feet and glanced over her shoulder at the other children scattered across the playground. They were chasing one another, shouting in games of tag, climbing on the jungle gym, blissfully unaware that a mystery was slowly surfacing in their midst. The faint squeak of the swings carried on the breeze, ordinary and cheerful, and yet to her ears it felt like the sound belonged to another world altogether, one where the air was not charged with this peculiar tension. She knelt again and brushed away more sand with the side of her palm. Her fingers struck against another link of the chain, thick and unyielding. It was no mere scrap of metal or discarded piece of playground equipment. It belonged to something deliberate, something built. Jaden leaned closer, his eyes wide, and whispered in the breathless tone of a child convinced he had stumbled upon hidden treasure. "It goes deeper," he murmured, tugging again at the length of chain. The iron resisted, refusing to yield more than the smallest twitch, as though bound to a weight beyond his comprehension. Miss Roberts frowned, her mind working through possibilities. Perhaps it was an old drainage grate, some relic of the grounds before the school had been built. Perhaps it was only a fragment of construction material left behind and forgotten, but she could not quite convince herself. The links were far too large, the design too industrial, to have been discarded casually. A shadow fell across them, and two of the children had wandered over, curious about what had drawn their teacher's attention. She straightened quickly and waved them back, her voice sharper than she intended. The children retreated, startled, and she felt a pang of guilt. But there was a growing sense inside her that none of the students should be close to this thing until she understood it better. She looked back at Jaden, still crouched low, his small hands trembling with excitement. "I think that's enough for now," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. But he only shook his head, brushing aside another layer of wet sand. The shape beneath the earth was widening now, the links fanning outward in a pattern that suggested they were attached to more than a simple, buried object. She could feel the solidity of it with every handful of dirt removed, the impression that there was something much larger lying beneath. As more of the chain emerged, she noticed the sand around it sagged in an unnatural way, as though the soil was thinner there, as if hollow space lay underneath. That realization made her throat dry. She leaned down, using a stick to prod carefully at the edges of the cavity. The stick met resistance almost immediately, striking against a solid plane of metal just below the surface. She brushed faster now, heedless of the grit beneath her fingernails, until the faint outline of a circle became visible beneath the layers of sand. It was a lid. A massive, round lid of iron or steel, its surface pitted with rust but still solid, and the chain they had uncovered was not random at all. It was part of the mechanism that sealed it shut. A chill spread across Miss Roberts's arms, the fine hairs prickling against the breeze. Her imagination filled with unsettling images, sealed chambers, forgotten bunkers, things deliberately hidden away. She recalled a rumor she had once overheard in the staff lounge, an idle comment from an older teacher who had worked at the school for decades. He had said that the grounds had once belonged to the military before being turned into an educational site. She had dismissed it at the time as one of those local myths, half true and half exaggerated, the kind that grow with every telling. But now, kneeling beside the corroded lid in the sandbox, she felt the weight of those words pressing down on her. The other children had begun to notice her preoccupation. A small group gathered a few paces away, whispering and craning their necks to see. She gestured for them to step back, her tone calm but firm. They obeyed, though their eyes remained fixed on the scene, their voices hushed in the way children whisper when they sense that something important is happening. Jaden, still crouched beside the chain, looked at her with wide eyes. "It's like a treasure chest," he said, his voice trembling with anticipation. But Miss Roberts did not smile. To her, it no longer felt like treasure. It felt like a warning. The chain, the lid, the weight of metal buried just beneath the children's playground. It was too deliberate, too purposeful to be harmless. Her heart quickened as she rose to her feet, brushing sand from her hands. She needed to speak with the principal. This was no longer something she could dismiss as a child's curiosity. Still, she hesitated. The urge to uncover more pulled at her. Kneeling, once again, she traced her fingertips over the rough circle of the lid. The metal was cold despite the sunlight, its texture flaking against her skin. She pushed more sand aside, revealing a faint ridge around the circumference, like the edge of a hatch meant to be opened. The chain snaked through a rusted loop welded to the center, its purpose clear now. It had once been locked in place, securing whatever lay below from being accessed. A wave of unease tightened her chest. Why would something like this exist beneath the schoolyard? Why had no one known about it? She could almost imagine the decades that had passed since it had been buried, the rains and storms washing over it, children laughing and playing above it, never realizing what lay just a few feet beneath their feet. The bell rang in the distance, calling the children back inside for the end of recess. The sound jolted her from her thoughts, and she stood quickly, brushing her palms against her skirt. "Come on, Jaden," she said softly, reaching for his hand. He resisted at first, reluctant to leave his discovery behind, but the sharpness in her tone finally swayed him. Together, they walked back toward the building, the chain half exposed, the lid hidden just beneath the sand. As the children filed indoors, Miss Roberts cast one last glance over her shoulder. The sandbox looked innocent again, a simple corner of the playground where children had dug castles and moats for years. But now she could not unsee what lay beneath. The links of the chain glistened faintly in the weak light, like the edge of a story that had not yet been told. Inside, as the students settled into their desks, Miss Roberts felt the weight of the secret pressing against her thoughts. She knew she could not ignore it. What had seemed like a harmless curiosity was becoming something more with every passing moment. She needed answers. She needed help. And yet, in the deepest part of her mind, she already feared the truth, that some things buried by time are never meant to be uncovered. The remainder of the school day passed beneath a cloud of distraction for Miss Roberts. She moved from lesson to lesson, her voice carrying out the familiar instructions, yet her thoughts drifted constantly back to the sandbox. Each time she turned toward the window and saw the playground beyond, she imagined the chain lying half exposed, the soil clinging stubbornly to the hidden metal beneath. It gnawed at her attention, a secret tugging at her conscience demanding to be confronted. Jaden, too, seemed restless. His usual quiet focus in class had been replaced by the faraway stare of a boy whose imagination had been seized by discovery. Every so often, he glanced toward the window with a faint smile, as though certain that the treasure he had glimpsed still waited for him. By the time the last bell rang and the children spilled out into the halls with the giddy relief of dismissal, Miss Roberts felt the tension rising in her chest like a tide she could no longer contain. Once the last student had disappeared down the corridor, she walked swiftly to the principal's office. The corridors were mostly empty, their walls lined with faded student artwork, the echoes of departing footsteps fading into silence. She hesitated outside the office door, her hand hovering before she finally knocked. The principal, Mr. Hale, was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a tendency to treat minor issues with unnecessary gravity. When she explained what had been uncovered in the sandbox, she expected him to dismiss her concerns, to wave it away as some rusted debris not worth troubling over. Yet, as she spoke, describing the thickness of the chain and the unmistakable outline of the buried hatch, his expression shifted from skepticism to uneasy interest. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, listening intently. "You're certain it wasn't just a piece of playground equipment?" he asked at last, though the stiffness in his voice betrayed his doubt in his own suggestion. "I've worked here long enough to know the difference," she replied firmly. "This isn't a toy. It's heavy, industrial, and it's not just the chain. There's a hatch, circular with markings. It looks deliberate. It looks like it was meant to be sealed." Her words seemed to strike him with the same unease she herself had felt. He rose slowly, his chair scraping the floor, and gestured for her to lead the way. They crossed the playground together, the afternoon sun painting long shadows across the damp pavement. By then, most of the children had gone home and the sandbox sat quiet and unassuming, as if daring them to uncover its secret once more. Kneeling beside the spot, Miss Roberts brushed away the loose sand she had left earlier. The corroded links gleamed faintly, their ridges catching the light, and just beneath them the faint curve of the buried hatch was still visible. Mr. Hale crouched beside her, squinting as he touched the rusted surface with cautious fingers. The metal was cold, its roughness undeniable. He pushed aside more sand, and soon the full shape of the lid became unmistakable. A heavy disc of iron or steel, several feet across, inset into the earth like the entrance to some forgotten chamber. There were markings, just as she had said. Weathered letters etched into the surface, their outlines eroded but still legible in places. The characters looked military, stamped rather than carved, numbers and abbreviated words that hinted at codes long forgotten. Mr. Hale's face paled as he traced one of the faded letters. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply staring at the hatch as though it might open of its own accord. "This doesn't belong here," he muttered finally, his voice low. This is something else." He rose to his feet quickly, brushing his hands against his slacks as though eager to rid himself of the touch. Miss Roberts straightened beside him, watching his reaction closely. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. He glanced around the empty playground, his jaw tight. "We don't touch it again. Not until we know what it is. I'll call the authorities. If this is military, if this is what I think it is, then it isn't for us to uncover." Yet, even as he said it, his eyes betrayed the same fear she had felt. Fear of what they might have stumbled upon. Fear of the weight of history hidden beneath their feet. That evening, after the last staff member had gone home, The playground sat in silence once more. The chain lay uncovered, the hatch still concealed but waiting just below the surface, as if listening. A cool wind rustled the leaves at the edge of the yard, and the swings creaked faintly in the fading light. The ordinary schoolyard had been transformed into something else entirely, its innocence shattered by the revelation of iron beneath sand. The following morning brought officers to the school. 2 uniformed policemen arrived first, summoned quietly by Mr. Hale before the children were released for recess. Their presence was enough to stir murmurs among the staff, though no official explanation was given. They examined the sandbox with stern expressions, crouching beside the hatch, tapping at the metal, exchanging words Miss Roberts could not hear. Before long, they had roped off the area with bright tape, warning the children away with a mixture of firmness and forced cheerfulness. The hatch was now impossible to ignore. More of it had been uncovered during their inspection. The sand cleared away until the full circumference of the lid gleamed rust red in the morning light. It was enormous, larger than Miss Roberts had first realized, with a diameter that suggested not a small container, but an entrance to something far deeper. The chain, once a curious fragment, now appeared as a locking mechanism, its length threaded through a central loop that held the hatch sealed. The children whispered to one another during recess, pointing towards the sandbox from a distance, inventing their own stories. Some spoke of buried treasure, others of secret tunnels. Jaden stood apart from them, his face solemn, as though he alone understood the gravity of what he had uncovered. He glanced toward Miss Roberts more than once, his eyes searching hers for reassurance, though she had none to offer. When the police departed, promising to escalate the matter to specialists, the staff gathered in hushed conversation in the teacher's lounge. The story of the hatch spread quickly among them, and soon speculation filled the room. One of the older teachers, Mrs. Turner, spoke of her memories from decades earlier, when the land had indeed belonged to the military. She recalled fences, armed guards, and rumors of storage facilities buried deep underground. No one had ever confirmed what had been hidden there, but the knowledge that something had remained beneath their school all these years sent a shiver through the group. Miss Roberts listened quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor. She thought of Jaden's small hands brushing away the sand, of his innocent belief that he had uncovered treasure. How could a child comprehend the weight of such a discovery? And what lay beneath that hatch, sealed for decades, waiting for someone to stumble across it? As the day wore on, the tension in the school deepened. Parents began to hear whispers, children carrying fragments of the story home, returning with questions that teachers could not answer. Mr. Hale attempted to calm the staff, insisting that everything was under control, yet his eyes betrayed the strain he felt. The hatch had unsettled them all, stirring unease that no reassurances could ease. Late that afternoon, as the last of the students were dismissed, Miss Roberts lingered by the playground once more. The ropes cordoning off the sandbox fluttered in the wind, bright warnings against the backdrop of ordinary play structures. She stepped closer, her shoes sinking into the damp soil, and gazed down at the iron lid. The markings seemed clearer in the fading light, the stamped numbers catching the sun's last rays. She shivered, her imagination conjuring the possibilities. Storage bunkers, forgotten weapons, relics of a war most of the children could barely comprehend. The hatch looked as though it had been waiting, patient and silent, for decades. And now, by the smallest chance, by a boy digging in the sand during recess, it had been found. She could not shake the thought that the earth itself had shifted just enough to reveal it, that the storm had washed away the last grains of concealment, and once revealed, such things could not simply be ignored. The hatch had re-entered the world, demanding to be acknowledged, its secret pressing against the surface of an ordinary schoolyard. When she finally turned away, the playground seemed colder than before, its innocence drained by the presence of the iron circle glinting faintly beneath the tape. She knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever lay beneath that hatch would soon demand answers, and the school, the children, perhaps even the town itself would be drawn into its mystery. And somewhere, deep inside, though she would not admit it aloud, Miss Roberts already feared that the truth would not be a harmless relic, but something far more dangerous, something that had been buried for good reason and should never have been disturbed. The following morning dawned strangely quiet, the school grounds bathed in a pale light that did nothing to ease the tension hanging over the teachers who had learned what had been unearthed in the sandbox. The police had done their part the previous day, roping off the area, filing reports, and promising to contact the appropriate departments. Yet their departure had left behind not reassurance, but a gnawing sense of unfinished business. The hatch remained there, silent and immovable, a dark secret barely covered by the thin crust of sand that had failed to hide it for decades. Its presence seemed to change the air itself, as though the playground, once filled only with the joyful chaos of children, had become something altogether more dangerous. Miss Roberts stood near the window of her classroom that morning, watching the sunlight creep across the deserted yard. The yellow tape fluttered gently in the wind, a flimsy barrier against curiosity. Already, she could see children arriving with their parents, some pointing at the corner of the yard where the sandbox had been. The story had spread quickly, as stories always do among families with children, and what had begun as whispers was now open speculation. She imagined parents discussing it over dinner, voices lowered yet edged with unease, wondering what their children had been playing above all these years. By mid-morning, the situation escalated. 2 police cars pulled into the lot, joined by a dark van that bore no familiar insignia. Men and women in uniform emerged, their movements brisk and efficient, their faces set with the kind of seriousness that told Miss Roberts and the other staff that this was no routine visit. They went directly to the sandbox, examined the hatch, took measurements, photographed it from every angle. A few knelt to test the surface, knocking lightly with gloved hands, listening to the hollow resonance that came back from beneath. That sound carried farther than they intended, and though the children were kept indoors, some of them pressed their faces against the glass, wide-eyed, straining to hear what was happening. Mr. Hale gathered the staff in the lounge, his expression unusually grave. He explained that the discovery was now classified as a potential hazard, though he gave no details beyond that. The military had been contacted, he said, and specialists were on their way to evaluate the site. Until further notice, the area was strictly off-limits. There was to be no speculation with the children, no alarming them unnecessarily, though he seemed to realize even as he said it how impossible that request truly was. The teachers exchanged glances, their conversations hushed. Words like bunker and ammunition passed between them, though no one dared suggest the worst possibilities out loud. Miss Roberts felt the weight of those words pressing down on her. She thought of the corroded chain, of Jaden's small hands brushing the sand away, of the chill that had crawled up her spine when she realized the scale of what lay beneath. It was no longer just her secret or the principal's burden. It was now something that had drawn the attention of authorities, something that reached far beyond the boundaries of their small school. When recess time came, the children were not allowed onto the playground at all. Instead, they were ushered into the gymnasium, where they ran and shouted under the echoing roof. Their voices bounced against the walls, but there was an edge to their excitement, the restless energy of children who knew that something unusual was happening and were desperate for answers. Jaden kept to the side, sitting quietly with his knees pulled up, his eyes darting to the windows as though he longed to see the sandbox again. Outside, the specialists worked. By early afternoon, a larger team had arrived. Engineers, men in protective gear, and officers who spoke quickly into radios. They cordoned off not only the sandbox, but a wider section of the playground, driving stakes into the earth and unfurling heavy barriers that concealed their work from prying eyes. Trucks arrived with equipment, drills, and scanners, machines that hummed and whirred as they probed the earth around the hatch. The sound carried into the classrooms, low vibrations that rattled the windows. The children grew restless, their lessons interrupted by the constant reminder that something extraordinary was happening just beyond their reach. Questions spilled into the air. What are they doing out there? Is it treasure? Is it dangerous? The teachers tried their best to redirect their attention, but the lure of mystery was too strong. Even the youngest could sense that the adults were unsettled, that whatever was hidden beneath their playground was not something anyone had expected to find. By late afternoon, Mr. Hale announced that school would be dismissed early. Parents had already begun arriving, some alarmed by the sight of police cars and strange vehicles in the lot. Rumors swirled that the hatch concealed tunnels, that it led to a forgotten shelter, that it was filled with chemicals or gas. No one knew for certain, and the lack of answers only fueled the unease. Miss Roberts remained after dismissal, standing at the edge of the playground as the specialists worked. The hatch had been fully exposed now, its circumference cleared of sand, the rusted iron gleaming dully in the fading light. She watched as one of the engineers crouched beside it, pressing a device to the metal surface, his face unreadable as numbers flashed on the small screen. Another knelt with a flashlight, peering into the narrow seam around the edge, as though expecting to glimpse something inside. When one of them struck the surface with a hammer, the hollow ring that echoed back made her stomach twist. The sound was unmistakable. There was space beneath, vast and empty, waiting to be opened. The men exchanged glances, their expressions grave, and one of them spoke into his radio in a tone too quiet for her to hear. The atmosphere changed then. More officers arrived, expanding the perimeter, moving the curious families who had lingered at the edges of the school grounds farther away. Yellow tape became heavier barriers, and soldiers began to patrol the area with sharp eyes. The school was no longer merely a place of learning. It had become a site of investigation, its ordinary routines replaced by the cold machinery of authority. That evening, news vans appeared at the far end of the street. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters rehearsing lines into microphones. The secret was no longer confined to the school. The city knew, the county knew, and soon it seemed inevitable that the entire nation would know. A hatch had been found, a relic of the past, and the authorities were treating it with the kind of seriousness that hinted at danger. Inside her home, Miss Roberts could not escape the weight of what she had witnessed. She lay awake long into the night, replaying the image of the hatch, the chain, the grim faces of the specialists. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the rusted iron gleaming through the sand, and behind it, in her imagination, lay things she dared not name. Weapons, machines, remnants of wars long over but never truly buried. She thought of Jaden, of how close he had been, of how innocent his discovery had seemed at first. The thought chilled her. A child's game had opened a door that should never have been touched. The following day confirmed her fears. The military had taken control of the site. Armed vehicles parked at the edge of the school grounds, their presence unmistakable. Soldiers in fatigues directed the work with brisk efficiency, their voices curt and decisive. The school was closed entirely, classes suspended until further notice, families notified that their children would remain at home until the matter was resolved. The hatch, once just a curiosity in the Sandbox, had now disrupted the lives of hundreds, and though the town buzzed with questions, with rumors and speculation, one truth stood above them all. The thing buried beneath the playground was not trivial, and it was not safe. Whatever it was, it had lain in silence for decades, and now that it had been disturbed, it would change everything. Miss Roberts stood once more at the edge of the playground, aloud only because she had been the first to discover it with Jaden. The sand was gone now, the hatch completely exposed, its markings clearer under the floodlights the soldiers had set up. Numbers, letters, warnings half legible but chilling all the same. The iron disc seemed to pulse with menace, not alive but heavy with potential, the echo of history pressing outward. The first alarms had been raised. The town was awake to the truth that their school sat upon something buried long ago, and as Miss Roberts stared at the hatch, she knew with sinking certainty that this was only the beginning, that the true nature of what lay beneath had yet to reveal itself, and when it did, the consequences would reach far beyond the quiet streets of their small community. By the time the weekend arrived, the school grounds bore no resemblance to the familiar place the children had known. The playground was sealed behind tall fences draped with dark canvas to conceal what was happening within. Heavy vehicles came and went at all hours, their tires leaving deep tracks in the soft soil. Floodlights had been erected around the perimeter, so that even in the middle of the night the site glowed with stark white illumination. The air itself seemed altered, charged with a low hum of machinery and the clipped voices of soldiers who treated the area as though it were a battlefield, rather than a place where only days earlier children had laughed and played. The hatch that had once been hidden beneath the sand was now the center of an orchestrated operation. Teams of engineers and military specialists gathered around it, their equipment spread out across the grass. They worked methodically, speaking in codes and gestures, their movements precise. Miss Roberts watched from a distance, granted limited access by virtue of having been the one to first alert the principal. She felt both the weight of her responsibility and the surreal unreality of the situation. To think that only a child's game had led to this. Rows of soldiers, trucks bristling with antennae, men in protective gear moving cautiously around a corroded hatch. On the second day of their work, they began the task of opening it. The chain that had once been rusted fast to the surface was carefully removed, piece by piece, with tools that cut through the iron links like brittle twigs. Each clattering fragment was collected as though it might contain some vital clue. Then came the process of loosening the hatch itself. Enormous bolts, hidden beneath decades of earth and corrosion, were uncovered and slowly turned. The air was thick with the stench of rust, the sound of groaning metal echoing across the grounds. When at last the hatch lifted, the sound was one of tortured resistance, a screeching moan that seemed almost alive. The circle of iron rose inch by inch, revealing a darkness below that swallowed the beams of their flashlights. A chill gust of air escaped, carrying with it the damp, metallic scent of long-sealed spaces. Those watching fell silent. Even the constant hum of machinery seemed to fade as eyes strained toward the black opening, Ladders were secured, and the first of the specialists descended into the depths. Miss Roberts, though held back at the perimeter, could not look away. She imagined the feeling of being the first to step onto those hidden stairs, to breathe the air of a place untouched for decades. The thought filled her with awe and dread in equal measure. She recalled the hollow echo she had heard when the police tapped at the hatch days before, the sound of emptiness waiting beneath. Now that emptiness had been breached. Reports filtered back slowly, whispered at first, then relayed through radios. There was a chamber below, larger than expected, constructed of concrete and steel, its walls thick and lined with rusted supports. The stairwell led down into a broad corridor that opened onto a cavernous room. The soldiers spoke of rows of shelving, of crates stacked like forgotten monuments, their stenciled markings still faintly visible despite the years. Dust coated everything in thick layers, disturbed only by the first cautious steps of those who entered. The news spread quickly through the small town. Though no official statements were made, rumors moved faster than silence. People spoke of underground bunkers, of weapons, of forgotten stockpiles from a war most had only read about in books. Parents whispered about the danger of letting their children so near such a place, grateful now for the decision to close the school. Reporters camped at the edge of the restricted zone, their voices urgent as they speculated on camera, weaving stories from scraps of overheard words and shadowed glimpses. Inside the bunker, more discoveries were made. Wooden crates, their surfaces cracked with age, bore markings of military codes and faded symbols. Some contained helmets, their leather straps brittle, their metal dulled with corrosion. Others held rifles, oiled and wrapped in canvas that had stiffened with time, yet still recognizable as deadly instruments. Entire racks of ammunition gleamed faintly under the harsh glow of flashlights, the brass casings tarnished but intact. The sheer volume of material was staggering, as though an entire regiment's worth of supplies had been sealed away and forgotten. Miss Roberts could scarcely comprehend the scale of it when fragments of information reached her. The notion that all of this had lain directly beneath the feet of children playing in the sandbox filled her with a horror she could not articulate. She thought again of Jaden, of how close he had been to uncovering not just the chain, but the entrance itself. She imagined what might have happened if he had dug deeper alone, if he had somehow managed to shift the hatch himself. The thought made her shudder. The soldiers moved deeper into the complex as the days passed. What they found was not just a room, but a network of chambers, connected by narrow passageways that echoed with the clatter of boots. There were storage halls lined with rusting metal drums, offices with desks still bearing the skeletal remains of paperwork. The ink faded, but the typewritten letters faintly legible. On one desk lay a rotary phone, its cord brittle, as though waiting decades for a call that never came. The sense of stepping into a world frozen in time was overwhelming. It was as though the clock had stopped the moment the hatch had been sealed, leaving behind a ghost of the era that had built it. Posters clung faintly to the walls, their slogans half erased but still discernible, reminders of vigilance, of secrecy, of war. The deeper they went, the more the atmosphere grew heavy with the knowledge that this had not been a place of safety, but of preparation for conflict. By the fourth day, word came that they had discovered an inner chamber behind a set of reinforced doors. Unlike the other rooms, which bore the wear of decades, these doors were still solid, their hinges resistant, their steel unyielding. Cutting torches were brought in, the air filled with the acrid smell of burning metal as sparks rained down. When the doors finally gave way, the specialists stepped inside, their lights sweeping across a space that dwarfed the others. It was an armory of staggering scale. Rows upon rows of weapons stood in careful formation, as though waiting to be claimed. Tanks of fuel, their contents uncertain, lined the walls. The floor was scattered with rusted equipment, tools left as though abandoned mid-task. But the most unsettling detail was the silence, the sense that whoever had sealed this place had intended it to remain untouched for eternity. Miss Roberts listened to these accounts with growing dread. The staff, who remained in the town, exchanged fearful glances when they gathered, each of them aware that the situation had passed far beyond anything they had imagined. This was no mere curiosity from the past. This was a discovery with consequences that reached into the present, a reminder that the shadows of history could stretch forward without warning. At night, she dreamed of the underground halls, of soldiers from a bygone era moving silently through corridors lit by flickering bulbs, their faces grim, their voices hushed with secrets. She dreamed of the hatch closing again, of chains tightening, of the earth swallowing the secret once more. Yet each morning, when she returned to the edge of the school grounds, she saw the floodlights burning, the soldiers moving, the hatch open wide like a wound that could not be closed. And always, in the back of her mind, was the question that none of them could ignore. If all of this had been hidden so deliberately, what had the builders feared? What had they prepared for? The answer, she feared, lay not in the crates of rifles or the stacks of ammunition, but in something deeper, something still waiting in the darkness beyond. The underground storehouse had been revealed, its contents catalogued with growing alarm. Yet, as the operation expanded, as more doors were opened and more chambers explored, it became clear that the most dangerous secret had not yet been uncovered. Something lay beyond those reinforced walls, something that had been sealed with a care unlike any of the others. And when it was found, the town would no longer whisper with curiosity but tremble with the weight of the truth. The discoveries within the underground storehouse had already exceeded the imagination of those who first witnessed the rusted hatch rising from the sand. But, as the soldiers and engineers continued to press deeper, there grew a mounting sense that they had not yet reached the true heart of the place. Each new chamber brought with it both fascination and unease. The endless racks of rifles that would never fire again, the drums of fuel that might still contain volatile contents, the offices frozen in time with papers scattered across desks as though abandoned mid-shift. Yet, for all the artifacts of war that lay preserved in dust, there was an unmistakable feeling among the experts that these were merely the outer layers of a greater secret. The reinforced doors discovered at the end of the largest hall stood like sentinels, their surfaces scarred by rust yet still solid, the kind of barriers built not to keep something out, but to keep something in. It took an entire day of cutting, prying, and torching before those doors finally gave way. The acrid smoke of molten steel clung to the air as sparks cascaded in showers across the concrete floor. The soldiers stood back as the engineers forced the last of the hinges to yield, the shriek of tearing metal echoing down the passage like a scream. When the doors opened, they revealed a cavernous chamber unlike any of the others. Its ceiling arched higher, its walls built of thicker concrete, lined with heavy girders designed to withstand immense pressure. The moment the lights swept across the space, the mood among the men shifted from grim curiosity to silent alarm. At the center of the chamber rested a massive object draped in a thick black tarp, its size immense, its shape indistinct but commanding. The cloth sagged heavily, pulled tight in some places, slack in others, hinting at the curved contours it concealed. Around the base of the object lay coils of rusted cable, corroded control panels, and the skeletal remains of machinery whose purpose could only be guessed. It was as though the engineers of the past had built this room for one singular item, and everything else in the chamber existed only in service to it. The specialists moved cautiously, their boots crunching on decades of dust. Their voices dropped to hushed tones, the way men speak when standing before something sacred or cursed. One reached for the tarp, his gloves brushing the stiffened fabric, and for a moment he hesitated, as though some instinct warned him against what lay beneath. But orders were orders, and with a swift motion they pulled the covering back. The sight that greeted them froze the air in their lungs. Beneath the tarp lay the dull, curved shell of an atomic bomb. Its casing was enormous, its body stretching across the platform like the husk of some prehistoric beast. The metal was pitted with rust, yet intact, its surface marked by faded stenciled numbers and symbols still visible despite the years. A nose cone protruded at one end, streamlined for the purpose of destruction, while the tail fins at the other spread outward like the remnants of wings. Though time had scarred its appearance, there was no mistaking its identity. This was no ordinary bomb. It was a relic of the Cold War, a weapon designed for annihilation, forgotten, or perhaps deliberately concealed beneath a schoolyard where children once laughed. The soldiers stepped back instinctively, as though distance could shield them from the reality of what they had uncovered. Their eyes darted to the engineers, seeking confirmation, denial, anything to contradict the terror that recognition had sparked in their minds. But the engineers only exchanged grim looks, their silence louder than any words. Instruments were brought forward, meters and scanners humming as they were pressed against the casing. The readings that flickered across the screens drained what little color remained from the men's faces. Though corroded and aged, the bomb was still active. Its core had not been rendered inert by time. The systems within, though degraded, remained dangerously unstable. What lay before them was not simply a relic of history, but a living hazard. A sleeping monster whose awakening could reduce the town above to ash. The command to evacuate was given at once. Radios crackled with clipped instructions, orders relayed with urgency but without panic. Outside, the floodlights blazed brighter, the soldiers' movements sharpened. Families were told to leave their homes, to gather belongings only if they could do so in minutes. Sirens wailed across the quiet town, startling residents from their routines, filling the streets with fear and confusion. Within the hour, the school, the neighborhood, and the surrounding blocks were emptied of people, their streets lined with vehicles heading swiftly away. Miss Roberts was among those ushered back, her protests cut short by the soldier who gripped her arm with a firm but not unkind hand. She had seen the look in the eyes of the men who came up from the depths, and she knew better than to argue. As she moved with the tide of evacuees, she caught sight of Jaden among the crowd, clinging to his mother's hand, his face pale with bewilderment. Their eyes met only briefly, but in that glance she saw reflected the enormity of what his innocent curiosity had unleashed. He had pulled at a chain in the sand, and in doing so had drawn forth a secret that threatened them all. The town transformed in hours into a place of desolation. Checkpoints were established at every road, soldiers stood guard at intersections, and armored vehicles patrolled the perimeter. Helicopters thundered overhead, their searchlights sweeping across the empty streets. The school stood at the center of it all, a fortress of light and barriers, while beneath its foundations the bomb lay waiting, patient as it had been for decades, indifferent to the chaos it inspired. Specialists worked through the night, their task monumental. They examined the casing inch by inch, documenting the corrosion, tracing the cables that snaked away into defunct control panels. They studied the tail assembly, noting the fragility of the structure, the risk that even the slightest mishandling might trigger disaster. Their voices remained low, their movements precise, as though even sound itself might disturb the slumbering giant. The news broke nationally by the next day. Though details were scarce and officials careful with their language, the implication was clear. An unexploded weapon of staggering destructive power had been found beneath an elementary school. The country reacted with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Reporters crowded the perimeter, their broadcasts carried across televisions and radios into every household. Experts speculated on how such a weapon had come to be hidden there, arguing over whether it had been a remnant of Cold War paranoia or a forgotten part of a weapons program long since abandoned. For Miss Roberts, the explanations mattered less than the reality. She replayed every moment in her mind. The glint of rust in the sand, the boy's eager hands, the way her heart had tightened when she first brushed the soil from the hatch. At each stage, she had thought it merely strange, unsettling, but manageable. Now, she saw how naive that had been. The ground beneath their feet had hidden not just the past, but the threat of annihilation. And all it had taken was one child's curiosity to bring it back into the light. The town remained under evacuation as the operation stretched on. Experts in nuclear ordnance were flown in, men and women whose calm demeanor belied the magnitude of the task before them. They spoke in terms of containment, of stabilization, of ensuring that the weapon could be made safe. Yet, beneath their technical words, the truth was evident. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the consequence would be catastrophic. Days blurred together as the work continued. Soldiers slept in shifts, their eyes always wary. Families huddled in shelters or with relatives in nearby towns, waiting for news that might mean they could return, or that they had lost everything. The atmosphere was one of suspended dread, as though the entire community balanced on the edge of a blade. For Miss Roberts, there was little comfort in the reassurances offered by officials. She thought of the children who had run across that playground, the games that had unfolded mere feet above the sleeping bomb. She thought of Jaden most of all, and how close he had come to danger beyond his comprehension. She could not decide whether to see him as the luckiest boy in the world or the one who had nearly doomed them all. And yet, even amid the fear, there was a strange sense of awe. To stand at the intersection of past and present, to witness history not as something in books, but as a force that could still reach forward with terrifying immediacy. It was humbling. The bomb had been built in another age, by men who had lived in fear of enemies across oceans, who had prepared for wars that never came. It had been hidden with the intention that it might one day be used. Then it had been forgotten. Now it was a ghost from that era, summoned into the present by accident, by the smallest shift of sand and the curiosity of a child. The shocking discovery reverberated far beyond the small town. It was discussed in capitals, debated in parliaments, analyzed in think tanks. But for those who had lived beside it unknowingly, it was more than policy or history. It was a revelation that safety is always more fragile than it seems, that the past is never truly buried, and that sometimes the most ordinary of places can conceal the most extraordinary of dangers. As the days of evacuation stretched on, and the specialists continued their delicate work beneath the school, Miss Roberts could not shake the image of the bomb resting in its chamber, vast and silent, like an ancient beast waiting to awaken. She wondered if future generations would ever understand how close they had come, or if the story would fade into legend, a tale whispered about the time when a boy found a chain in the sandbox and nearly changed the fate of them all. The days that followed the discovery of the bomb unfolded in a strange suspension, as though time itself had bent beneath the weight of what had been uncovered. The town, once defined by the quiet routines of small-town life, was transformed into a place of hushed voices and watchful eyes. Families who had been ordered to evacuate sat in unfamiliar rooms in neighboring cities or crowded into motels, their belongings hastily packed into suitcases, their minds circling endlessly around the same question. What would become of their homes, their school, their very way of life, now that the earth had revealed what it had hidden for so long? The military presence deepened with every hour. Roadblocks stood on every approach into town, armored vehicles positioned like immovable sentinels at intersections, their crews vigilant and unsmiling. Helicopters cut across the sky day and night, their blades a constant reminder of the emergency. At the school itself, floodlights burned through the darkness, making the night indistinguishable from day, while specialists moved in and out of the underground chamber with the slow, careful precision of men walking a tightrope above catastrophe. The bomb, that hulking relic, lay at the center of it all like a malignant heart, demanding absolute respect and threatening annihilation should even one mistake be made. For Miss Roberts, the evacuation blurred into a series of restless nights and anxious days. She stayed in a shelter with other teachers, their cots lined in neat rows beneath a ceiling that never seemed to dim the electric glare. They spoke in whispers, each one returning to the moment when the hatch had first been uncovered. Some remembered the sound of the hollow ring when the police had tapped the metal, others the sight of the chain as it coiled up through the sand. But for her, it was a look in Jaden's eyes that would not leave her. The innocence of his discovery, the thrill of thinking he had found something wondrous. She wondered if he understood now what had truly been brought to light, or if the enormity of it all was too vast to touch the mind of a child. In the following week, the specialists succeeded in stabilizing the weapon enough to begin the process of transport. That news rippled through the temporary shelters like a fragile thread of relief. Military convoys rolled through the town in the dead of night, their headlights dimmed, their wheels crunching over the pavement with a sound that carried far in the silence. Residents who had sneaked back to the outskirts watched from the shadows as the convoy passed, whispering prayers or curses under their breath. The bomb was taken away at last, sealed in reinforced containers, its removal a triumph of discipline and luck. Only after it had gone did the air of the town shift from dread to exhaustion, as though everyone had been holding their breath for days and now finally dared to exhale. Yet the consequences of its presence could not be carried away so easily. Journalists remained camped at the edges of the community, their cameras waiting to catch the return of families to their homes. Historians descended with questions and notebooks, eager to trace the forgotten history of the military storage facility that had once occupied the land. Experts debated on television how such a weapon could have been left beneath the earth without record or retrieval, their arguments heated, their theories speculative. Some said it had been the part of a secret program meant to disperse weapons across the country in case of invasion. Others that it had been a test, a prototype hidden away when it was deemed unnecessary. None could provide certainty, and the lack of answers only deepened the mystery. When residents at last returned, they found their homes untouched but altered by the knowledge of what had been so near. Children ran again through the streets, but their laughter was tinged with the lingering awareness of what had been beneath their playground. Parents spoke quietly at dinner tables, their eyes flicking to their children with gratitude and unease. Conversations ended with silence, the kind that comes when words cannot bridge the gap between fear and relief. At the school, the playground was forever changed. The sandbox was gone, its frame dismantled, the earth beneath excavated and filled anew. Fresh sod was laid across the area, bright green against the worn patches of grass that surrounded it. To an unknowing eye, it looked like nothing more than a field of lawn, but for those who had lived through the evacuation, it was impossible to see it without imagining the chain, the hatch, the darkness below. The children who returned to classes looked toward that corner with a mix of curiosity and fear, whispering stories to one another in the kind of hushed tones that turn fact into legend. A memorial was planned almost immediately. The town council, pressured by both residents and the weight of history, agreed that the event could not simply be forgotten. A plaque was commissioned to be placed at the edge of the schoolyard, its words chosen carefully, to honor the vigilance of those who had acted quickly, to remember the danger that had lurked unseen, and to remind the future generations that even the most ordinary of places can conceal extraordinary truths. For Miss Roberts, life could not return to what it had been. She found herself walking more slowly through the halls, her gaze lingering on the faces of her students, each one fragile and full of futures that might have been extinguished in an instant. At night, she dreamed of the underground chamber, of the bomb's curved shell gleaming beneath harsh lights, of the sound it made when the instruments confirmed its unstable core. She dreamed of children playing above it, their footsteps a drumbeat over the silence of destruction lying just beneath. She carried those images with her, heavy as the rusted chain had been when she first touched it. As for Jaden, he was celebrated in ways that bewildered him. Reporters wanted to speak with him, to photograph the boy whose curiosity had led to the discovery. His name appeared in articles, his picture on screens, though he never understood why people called him a hero. He had not meant to save anyone. He had only dug in the sand as children do, chasing the thrill of a small mystery. Yet the adults around him spoke of him with awe, saying he had prevented a disaster, that his sharp eyes and persistence had spared the town. He only nodded quietly when they spoke, his hand always clinging tightly to his mother's, his eyes drifting back to the playground as though still searching for the glint of rust in the sand. Over time, the town tried to settle back into its rhythm, but the memory of those weeks never left them. Each autumn, when the wind swept across the fields and the playground stood empty in the chill, residents remembered the nights of evacuation, the sirens, the lights, the fear. Each spring, when the grass grew lush and the children returned to their games, they remembered that below their feet, once, had rested a bomb capable of erasing them all. The story spread beyond their borders, told and retold until it became something larger than the town itself. In history books, it became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the Cold War's lingering shadows, of the dangers that can lie buried until chance brings them back into the light. But for those who had lived it, it was not a tale but a memory, etched deep, impossible to erase. And so the town moved forward, carrying with it the knowledge that the past is never truly gone. Beneath the laughter of children and the hum of daily life, beneath the soil itself, history waits, patient and silent, until the moment it is uncovered. Some secrets are buried with reason, some are forgotten by neglect. But all of them remain, just beneath the surface, waiting for the day when a child's small hand brushes aside the sand and reveals what was meant to stay hidden forever. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button now so you never skip the next shocking story. Watch our next video for even more unbelievable discoveries, and check out the other videos on the channel that will leave you speechless. And if this story blew your mind, share this video with your friends. They won't believe what happened either.